You know, as someone who enjoys philosophy, you've probably thought about how we break down the world. I mean, from tiny particles to huge ecosystems, right?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if that division into layers is really like a true structure or just a way we make sense of things in our minds.
Oh, absolutely. That gets right to the core of what we're looking at today. It's a fundamental question in ontology and how we understand reality.
Exactly. So, this deep dive, we're going deep into levels of organization, specifically in biology. Our guide is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on this. And what's fascinating is this: it seems simple on the surface. Atoms make molecules, molecules make cells, and so on. But it's actually super complex. There's a lot of debate about it in both biology and philosophy.
Totally. And for you as a philosopher listening, this idea, which sounds like it's just biology, actually connects to a lot of core philosophical ideas. Ontology, what is being at these different levels? Epistemology, how do we know about them? And then there's the whole reductionism versus emergence thing, right? And how different fields of science relate to each other. It's amazing how a concept that seems basic in biology has such deep philosophical roots and implications for how we see the world.
So, what we're trying to do today is really unpack this levels of organization idea. Like, where did it come from? What are the challenges? And why is it still important for understanding nature? The encyclopedia gives us a lot to think about, going through the history and the different philosophical interpretations.
It does, and it's important to realize this isn't a new idea. The idea that nature is ordered in a hierarchy is really old.
Right. The encyclopedia takes us all the way back to Aristotle. He had this idea of a graded scale of living things. It was like a ladder with plants at the bottom and humans at the top. That hierarchical way of thinking was very influential for a long time.
Definitely. Aristotle's idea developed into the great chain of being, this grand, divinely ordained hierarchy from God at the top, down through angels, humans, animals, and then plants, and inanimate matter. It was a dominant way of understanding the cosmos and where we fit in.
Then, with the scientific revolution, things started to change. We see attempts to classify nature in a hierarchical way, but based on science, like Linnaeus's taxonomy and Comte's hierarchy of the sciences. The idea of ordered levels persisted, but it was justified by empirical observation and scientific methods, not divine order. It's a change in the basis for these hierarchical claims.
Exactly. We shift from a theological or metaphysical basis to one grounded in observation and scientific methods. But the idea of levels as a way to understand complexity remains a powerful one.
Fast forward to the early 20th century, we see philosophers like Samuel Alexander and C.D. Broad talking about levels of existence, being, or complexity. This was connected to emergentism, wasn't it? The idea that new properties pop up at higher levels that you couldn't predict just from the lower levels.
Yes, and this is where we start to see ideas that are still important today in discussions about levels. The idea of level-specific laws, that each level might have its own rules that aren't just reducible to the lower levels, and the idea that complexity increases as we go up the levels.
But the encyclopedia points out something interesting. These early philosophical ideas about levels were kind of separate from the actual biological research happening at the time. They were more abstract, theoretical. This makes you think about the relationship between conceptual frameworks and empirical science.
Right. It was philosophy happening alongside empirical biology, but not really integrated with it. The foundation for how we understand levels of organization in biology today comes later, with the organicist biologists of the early to mid-20th century, people like Joseph Woodger, Ludwig von Bertalanffy, and Joseph Needham.
Organicism is described as this third way between mechanism, the view that life is like a machine, reducible to its parts, and vitalism, the idea of a non-physical life force. This is a classic debate in the philosophy of science. Reductionism versus holism when understanding living things.
Exactly. The organicists wanted a middle ground. They agreed with the mechanists that there's no mystical force, but they also argued that just breaking everything down to physics and chemistry misses something essential: organization. How living things are structured, the relationships between their parts. They said that was key to understanding life.
And the encyclopedia emphasizes three key tenets of organicism that supported this levels thinking. First, the focus on organization as a defining feature of life.
Right. It wasn't just the molecules themselves, it was how they were arranged and interacted to make functional units. This emphasis on relationships is interesting philosophically, especially in the context of structure and function.
Second, the hierarchical order of parts within organisms, the familiar idea that organs are made of tissues, tissues of cells, and so on. This nested structure was central to their thinking.
This nested compositional hierarchy was crucial. It implied that to understand something at a higher level, you need to understand its lower level parts and how they're organized. Different levels of analysis aren't just convenient, they're necessary.
And the third tenet was the autonomy of biology as a science. Biology wasn't just applied physics and chemistry. It had its own principles, its own phenomena, and its own levels of investigation. This connects to debates about the unity of science and whether there are irreducible biological laws.
And here's where levels take center stage. Joseph Woodger, for instance, he talked about how biologists break down organisms, organ systems, organs, tissues, cells, and so on. He said it's a hierarchy of composing parts or relata in a hierarchy of organizing relations, and that these relations and the things they relate can only be studied at their own levels. You can't just reduce them to their lower level parts.
Okay, that's a clear way to put it. This concept of nested compositional hierarchies, wholes at higher levels, parts at lower levels, is still fundamental in how we understand biological organization. It suggests a reality with layers, and that we need a multi-level approach to understand it.
It laid the groundwork. But the encyclopedia points out that the levels concept went in different directions after organicism, becoming somewhat fragmented. It raises the question of how stable and coherent scientific concepts are, even when they seem intuitive.
Right, general systems theory and hierarchy theory came along. They looked at systems broadly, not just biological ones. And while they recognized hierarchies, levels of organization sometimes wasn't the main focus. It's a tension between explaining things specific to a domain versus explaining things universally.
Exactly. The emphasis was on finding principles that apply to all kinds of systems, biological, social, even physical. The specifics of biological organization at different levels weren't always emphasized.
But then we get more direct philosophical accounts of levels of organization. The encyclopedia talks about how philosophers wanted clearer definitions of levels and hierarchy. It seems the initial intuitive understanding wasn't enough. And that desire for clarity is, of course, what philosophy is all about.
Exactly. Scientists worked with an intuitive understanding of levels, but philosophers wanted more conceptual clarity and rigor.
And the first big philosophical account we see is the layer cake account by Oppenheim and Putnam. This was a very influential model that tried to be comprehensive to explain all uses of the term levels in one framework.
Yes, and a key part of their idea was stepwise compositional relations between levels. Like, the things at one level neatly and completely make up the things at the level above it, like layers in a cake. This shows a commitment to a very hierarchical and compositional view of reality.
And they said that these levels of nature matched up perfectly with levels of scientific inquiry. Each level of organization would have a corresponding scientific discipline, and vice versa. They even proposed 6 reductive levels, from social groups down to elementary particles, with microreduction as the link between them. This reflects the philosophical ideal of a unified scientific understanding of the world.
Their idea of a natural order of sciences mirroring the levels of nature was part of their vision for a unified science. They thought their layer cake model was a better alternative to earlier, less formal hierarchies of scientific disciplines.
However, the encyclopedia tells us that the layer cake account has problems. For one, the perfect match between levels in scientific fields doesn't work in reality. Take cognitive neuroscience, for example. It uses and connects multiple levels, from the neural to the psychological. It challenges the idea of perfectly separate scientific fields.
Right. And the idea of everything being neatly composed step by step also runs into problems. For example, blood, which is a tissue, it contains molecules directly, like vitamins and water, without a separate cell level in between. Nature is messier than that.
And maybe most importantly, trying to fit every use of levels into one definition doesn't match how the term is actually used in science. Scientists often use levels in ways that are specific to their context. It's another example of the tension between general philosophical ideas and specific scientific practices.
Precisely. Scientists know that reality isn't always perfectly layered, and that there are exceptions and complexities. The layer cake model, although important for trying to create a unified framework, was too rigid to fully capture the nuance of biological organization.
So we see more context-specific accounts emerging, like the levels of mechanisms perspective by Bechtel and Craver. This is connected to the new mechanism in philosophy of science, which focuses on understanding things by figuring out their mechanism.
Yeah. Instead of trying to define levels universally, they look at how the concept works within a specific biological mechanism. They focus on constitutive parthood, how lower-level parts make up a higher-level mechanism that does something. This is a move away from abstract ontology and toward a more grounded, practice-based philosophy of science.
This seems much closer to how science is actually done. It gives up on a single definition and says that what counts as a level depends on the specific mechanism you're studying. It also moves away from the idea that levels in nature have to line up with traditional scientific disciplines. Philosophically, this raises questions about scientific explanation and the role of context in defining concepts.
Exactly. Levels of mechanisms are about levels within specific mechanisms, and those don't have to perfectly match up with traditional scientific fields. It supports a more pluralistic view of scientific explanation. To understand something, you might need insights from different levels and different disciplines, not just reduction to one level.
So the basic idea here is that a lower level thing is a part of the mechanism that produces the activity at a higher level. And a part at one level can itself be a mechanism made of even lower level parts, creating a nested hierarchy within a specific system.
That's it. They use the example of spatial memory and long-term potentiation. You have spatial memory at the behavioral level, then the cognitive level of spatial map formation in the hippocampus, then the cellular electrophysiological level with long-term potentiation, and finally the molecular level with things like NMDA receptors. Each level is a component in the mechanism for the level above it.
And while there are similarities with the traditional idea of levels, things being composed of other things, generally smaller things making up bigger things, levels of mechanisms are more localized. Different mechanisms might have completely different levels, and even within one mechanism, it's not always clear if two things are at the same level. This context dependence is a big difference for more universal accounts.
Right. Levels of mechanisms don't form neat horizontal layers across everything. They can be more like interconnected points defined by their relationships within a specific pathway. And the idea of being at the same level isn't as important as understanding the specific relationships within the mechanism.
The encyclopedia brings up an interesting point. This account defines levels in terms of other concepts like mechanism. So you could ask, do levels of mechanisms really give us a new idea of levels, or is it just a way of talking about the structure of a mechanism? It's a question about how scientific concepts relate to each other.
Yeah, it's a valid point. The worry is that levels might not be adding anything new beyond describing the mechanism itself. This makes levels of mechanisms pretty different from earlier ideas of levels in biology, which were trying to categorize things in a broader, more ontological way.
And there are newer ideas, like the flat view of levels within mechanisms. This view says that what we call levels might just be modules in a bigger network without a fundamental ontological difference between them. This challenges even the more localized view of levels in the mechanistic account.
Right. The hierarchical structure might be because of how we model these systems, not because reality itself is layered.
Let's move on to Wimsatt's local maxima account, which is a different approach. Instead of a strict definition, he describes the typical features that levels tend to have. It's a more descriptive approach that acknowledges that the natural world is complex and messy.
Yes, and he wanted to counter what he saw as simplistic reductionist views. He wanted to show how higher-level things are important and somewhat independent. He called his view a tropical rainforest ontology, a view of reality that embraces diversity and complexity, unlike a more sparse reductionist view.
One key idea in his account is that levels are compositional and nested, with lower-level wholes being parts at higher levels. He even says that levels are a deep, non-arbitrary, and extremely important feature of the ontological architecture of our natural world. That's a strong statement about the reality and importance of levels, even if they're defined by features and not strict rules.
It is. And he says that levels are usually made of things of similar size and dynamic properties that mostly interact with each other. He uses the metaphor of sieve. Theories at a certain level are like sieves, focusing on things of a certain scale and dynamic.
But maybe the most unique thing in Wimsatt's account is levels as local maxima of regularity and predictability in the organization of things. Okay, let's break that down for our philosopher listeners.
Imagine a graph. One axis is the scale of organization, maybe size or complexity. The other axis is how regular and predictable things are. Wimsatt says that if you plot this, you'll see peaks at certain scales. Those peaks are the levels of organization. The things at those peaks are stable, with patterns and regularities that allow us to make predictions and explanations. That wouldn't be possible at smaller or larger scales. He also suggests that these levels are the most likely states of matter under different conditions.
So to use molecules as an example, they form a level in Wimsatt's view because there's a peak in regularity and predictability at the molecular scale. Molecules tend to behave in consistent ways, which allows us to have laws and make predictions about them.
Exactly. And he mentions other features that levels often have, like processes being slower at higher levels, multiple realizability, where the same high-level feature can be made in different ways at lower levels, and some degree of independence for causal relationships at higher levels. But he emphasizes that these are tendencies, not strict requirements for something to be a level. This recognizes that organization in nature is variable.
He also acknowledges that in very complex systems, like many biological ones, the boundaries between levels can get blurry. He talks about perspective. Our accounts become incomplete and depend on what we choose to focus on, and causal thickets, where it's hard to even define different perspectives. This aligns with the philosophical understanding that natural phenomena are complex and interconnected.
Yeah, Grusmer has a similar idea. He suggests that scientists encounter complex systems as these causal thickets, and then through research they prune them into more manageable perspectives, maybe finding new levels of organization in the process.
And to address concerns that his account is vague because it's based on typical features, Wimsatt emphasizes the importance of robustness. He says a level is more likely to be real and significant if we can detect and measure it in multiple independent ways. This connects to the idea in philosophy that convergent evidence is important for knowledge.
Exactly. A level and its parts should be detectable in multiple ways. If they are, it's more likely that it's a real level of organization.
Now, even though the concept of levels is used everywhere, the encyclopedia points out that some philosophers and scientists are skeptical about its usefulness. They say nature might be too complex and diverse to be neatly divided into layers. This skepticism challenges our desire for order and categorization.
It does. Think about the organism level. A blue whale and a yeast cell are both organisms, but they're vastly different in size, complexity, and how they're organized. And if you look at their parts, the things at the next level down, it's even more diverse. Whales have organs, tissues, cells. Yeast cells have things like membranes, nuclei, mitochondria. There's no single set of parts that defines the level below organism for all organisms. This lack of uniformity makes you question these broad classifications.
And the skeptics aren't just saying it's hard to define organism. The same problems come up with other levels, like cells and their parts. The same kind of thing can be part of very different higher-level wholes, so there's no guarantee that a thing has level-specific properties.
Potocnik and McGill are strong critics. They say that the idea of levels depends on things being composed in a uniform way, which they say doesn't happen in biology. They think that imposing levels on nature might hide how fluid and interconnected biological systems really are.
And this lack of uniformity challenges the idea that explanations at a particular level are better or worse than others. Reductionists might say that molecular explanations are the most fundamental, while anti-reductionists might say higher-level perspectives are better. But if levels themselves are not well defined, then these claims about one level being superior become problematic philosophically.
Exactly. The value of an explanation at a particular level depends on what you're studying and the questions you're asking. There's no universally best level. Plus, biological explanations often use insights from multiple levels at the same time, further blurring the lines.
So the skeptics are saying that the concept of levels, even though it's popular, might actually make it harder to have nuanced discussions in science and philosophy. It presents a picture that's too simple and potentially misleading. Some even call it useless or misleading. That's a strong challenge to a core idea in biology.
And this skepticism is productive. It's led to deflationary approaches that suggest we replace levels with more precise concepts like scale, referring to size and time and networks or explanatory styles. The idea is that these concepts might capture some of the insights we get from levels, but without the conceptual problems.
For example, organizing our understanding based on the scale of things, are we looking at molecules or ecosystems, seems less prone to the definition problems that levels have. Similarly, thinking about the different timescales of biological processes can be very helpful.
However, the encyclopedia points out that these deflationary counts might miss some of what levels does in biology. The cellular level, for instance, seems to be really important in biology in a way that can't be fully captured by just talking about scale. You can't ignore how useful the concept of levels is for research and organizing knowledge.
This brings us to the idea of levels as a fragmentary and heuristic notion. Recent work in philosophy of biology tries to connect the philosophical criticisms with how scientists actually use the concept. It suggests that maybe we shouldn't expect a perfect, universal definition of levels because scientists use it more flexibly. It highlights the importance of paying attention to how science is actually done.
Yes, it's important. Instead of focusing on what levels are in some ultimate sense, this approach looks at what levels do for scientific reasoning. Scientists have to make choices about what to focus on and what to ignore when they try to understand complex systems.
So levels can be a way to simplify things, helping scientists pick out the important features of a system. It can also be a guide for research, leading to new fields that study particular levels. And there's the idea that similar things are often made of similar things, which isn't always true, but is a useful starting point.
Exactly. This doesn't aim to give a complete philosophical account of levels. It tries to identify some basic features that any good philosophical account should address. It's a middle ground between those who think levels are essential and those who are skeptical.
Building on this idea of levels as a tool, we have the fragmentary approach. Brooks, for example, says that we can understand how levels are used by looking at two ways it's used. One is as a tool, something scientists use in specific experiments to make inferences. This emphasizes how useful the concept is in everyday research.
Like a working concept in the lab, helping to design experiments and interpret data in a specific context.
The other is as a doctrine, a widely accepted idea that you find in textbooks and theories. It's part of the basic framework of biological knowledge. This emphasizes how important the idea is for education and conceptually in biology.
So levels is both a practical tool and a general concept. And this dual usage suggests a reason for why it's used. It helps us structure scientific problems and organize knowledge.
Now, levels have always been connected to debates about reductionism. Can we explain higher level things completely in terms of lower level things? This is a big question in the philosophy of science.
Definitely. Oppenheim and Putnam's layer cake model was about reduction, reducing science to its most basic parts. Wimsatt's account, on the other hand, was a response to what he saw as simplistic reductionist views that didn't appreciate the emergent properties and independence of higher levels.
The encyclopedia talks about the classical Nagelian model of reduction. This model was about logically deriving one theory from another, using bridge principles to connect them. But it points out that this model didn't capture the difference between reducing theories across levels and comparing theories at the same level. We need more nuanced models of reduction that take into account the hierarchy of scientific knowledge.
Right. The Nagelian model treated those two situations the same way, reducing across levels versus comparing at the same level. We know now that it doesn't reflect how reduction really works in biology, especially with emergence in new properties.
This led to new wave models of reduction that included levels, trying to explain how reduction works across levels. But there were other perspectives too. Bickel's ruthless reductionism, for example, downplayed the importance of intermediate levels, arguing for direct reduction to molecular explanations. This sparked a lot of debate.
Bickel argued that cellular and molecular neuroscience could replace psychology entirely, and that other levels were just useful fictions for research, not real. He's even suggested a levels-less view, where the concept of levels gets in the way of understanding how different scales of biology relate.
On the other hand, philosophers like Hudeman and Love focus on a more detailed view of part-whole reduction, looking at composition and causality, which are often discussed using levels. And Kitcher used levels as a key part of his argument against reducing Mendelian genetics to molecular genetics. This shows how the idea of levels can be used to argue for and against reductionism.
Kitcher argued that what happens at the Mendelian level with chromosomes and traits can't be fully explained just by describing DNA. He saw the division of biology into different fields based on levels as reflecting something real in nature, supporting an anti-reductionist view.
We also see arguments for multi-level explanatory pluralism. Macaulay, for example, emphasizes how theories at different levels influence each other. Higher-level theories can guide lower-level research, and it's rare for well-established higher-level theories to be completely replaced. This suggests that to understand biology, we need explanations that work across multiple levels.
And Mitchell's integrative pluralism comes from seeing complex systems as having multiple levels, where things emerge at higher levels that can't be reduced to the lower levels. She says that because biological evolution is contingent, there are many valid ways to explain things at different levels. Brigant also emphasizes the importance of local explanations. The right level of analysis depends on the specific thing you're studying. Even new mechanism, while focused on finding mechanisms, is seen by some as supporting pluralism, although whether it's truly anti-reductionist is debated.
Another area where levels are important is the discussion of downward causation. Can higher-level things influence lower-level things? This is connected to emergentism, the idea that new properties emerge at higher levels.
Yes, and while downward causation might seem obvious like our intentions affecting our neurons, it's been controversial in philosophy. Whether downward causation is possible depends on how you define levels and their relationships.
A lot of the skepticism is about whether a whole can influence its parts. Craver and Bechtel, using their levels of mechanisms framework, argue against top-down causation. They say that what seems like downward causation is actually because of the relationship between levels within a mechanism. The higher-level activity is partially made up of the lower-level components, so it's not a separate causal influence.
They use the example of someone playing tennis, which increases glucose metabolism in their muscle cells. They say that playing tennis is partly made up of these cellular mechanisms. So the increased metabolism isn't a separate cause from the higher level, it's part of what playing tennis is.
But there are problems with this view. It's hard to separate causal and constitutive relationships in biology, and same-level causation becomes tricky in their framework. Also, can higher-level processes within a mechanism ever be truly distinct from what's happening at lower levels? It raises fundamental questions about causation and explanation in hierarchical systems.
It's interesting that in biology, downward causation is often understood as higher-level constraints affecting lower-level parts. For example, the cell membrane creates conditions that constrain how ion channels within it behave.
These biological examples often involve influence across scales rather than just between levels in a hierarchy. Like the overall structure of a tissue can influence individual cells. Woodward suggests we think about causation in terms of variables at different scales, not just within a hierarchy of levels.
And there are big questions that remain. Are these higher-level constraints really causation? And how does downward causation fit with the causal exclusion argument, which says that you can't have two separate things fully causing the same event?
It seems that the philosophical discussions about levels and downward causation haven't always been connected to how levels is used in real biological research and theory.
That's true. Biologists often use the idea of levels very practically to guide their research and interpret their findings.
For example, in the debate about the units of selection, what level does natural selection act on the idea of levels is a basic assumption. This debate wouldn't even make sense if we didn't think about life as being organized in levels.
Right. Whether selection acts mainly on genes, the gene-centered view, or on multiple levels, multi-level selection theory, is a key question. And it depends on the idea that life is organized hierarchically with different levels for selection to act on.
Okasha tries to define levels of organization specifically for natural selection, using ideas like fitness affecting interactions and how similar something is to a free-living organism. But even his proposal has been criticized for being too narrow.
And Aronin and Ramsey have a more deflationary approach. They say we can describe the level of selection directly in terms of how fitness is affected, separating it from the broader concept of levels in biology.
Then there's the hierarchy theory of evolution, which sees levels and hierarchies as fundamental to life. It distinguishes between ecological hierarchies about matter and energy and genealogical hierarchies about information transmission with different levels in each.
This theory sees the nested structure of biological systems as crucial for evolution. Different hierarchies come from different kinds of interactions and constraints.
Evolutionary transitions where new levels emerge, like the evolution of multicellularity, also relate to levels. Maynard Smith and Safmari said that these transitions involve replicating units becoming parts of a larger whole. This highlights the dynamic nature of biological organization over evolutionary time.
Like single-celled organisms becoming multicellular, where individual cells can't replicate on their own anymore. Maynard's theory focuses on how fitness gets transferred from lower-level units to the new, higher-level collective.
And the concept of levels is often used in discussions about complexity. We see an increase in hierarchies or nestedness over evolutionary history, and ways to measure complexity are often related to the number and types of levels. This connects levels to a major trend in the history of life.
Bonner looked at body size and the number of cell types as a measure of complexity. McShay differentiated between horizontal complexity, the diversity of parts at a level, and vertical complexity, the number of hierarchical divisions. How levels relate to complexity is a very active area of research.
What's really interesting is how the concept of levels is used in everyday biological research. It's not just an abstract idea, it influences how scientists design experiments, analyze data, and understand biology.
Definitely. Levels can be seen as peaks of observability and manipulability. The scale at which you observe a system determines what you see, and levels help you think about how to manipulate a system and test hypotheses.
Love uses examples like studies of mixed cell aggregates, where tissues are broken down into cells and then allowed to reform, showing how important it is to think about cell organization and interaction. And experiments that have created multicellularity in yeast show how scientists can actually manipulate the emergence of new levels.
These experiments, Love argues, support a kind of realism about levels.
Yeah.
They're not just tools, but reflect real features of the biological world that we can study.
This connection between levels and experiments is also important for developing theories. Thinking of cancer as a tissue-level problem, where cells revert to a simpler state, is similar to experiments that show how multicellularity can be gained and lost. This shows how the levels concept informs our understanding of both normal development and disease.
And tissue tectonics is another example. It shows how forces at the tissue level influence cell behavior and organization during morphogenesis, how organisms develop their shape.
Lastly, it's amazing how central levels are in teaching biology. It's a core idea in textbooks and curricula used to teach key concepts like emergence, different approaches to understanding life, and choosing the right scale of analysis. This shows its educational importance and how ingrained it is in biological thinking.
Eugene P. Odom's work in ecology education was very influential in making levels a fundamental concept. He stressed the importance of studying ecology at different levels, from organisms to ecosystems, to get a complete understanding.
And biology education today is using levels more deliberately to help students learn. The yo-yo strategy, moving between levels to understand a process, and the zoom map approach, encouraging students to explore things at different scales, show how valuable this concept is for teaching.
These approaches recognize that understanding biology requires being able to move between levels, seeing how things at one level affect and are affected by things at other levels.
So, to wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that levels of organization is a multifaceted concept. It has a long history, it's important in both philosophy and biology, and people are still debating and refining it. There's no one definition everyone agrees on.
That's right. But despite the challenges and different interpretations, the idea of levels has been really important for understanding how complex nature is. It makes us think carefully about things like reduction, emergence, and causation. And for our philosopher listeners, it shows how a seemingly simple biological concept connects to fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, and explanation.
Here's something to think about. Given all the debate about levels, does the fact that it's still used so much in research and education mean that it points to a fundamental truth about reality that we're still trying to understand? Or is it mainly a useful tool, even if it's not perfect, that shapes how we think about nature? How does the idea of levels affect your own philosophical views on reality and knowledge?
It's a question worth thinking about. If you want to explore this more, look into the work of the philosophers and biologists we mentioned, and related ideas like emergence, reductionism, and systems thinking. Maybe you'll find new ways that the idea of levels can help you understand other areas you're interested in.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's giving you a valuable and interesting perspective on this seemingly simple but actually complex idea that's so important for understanding the living world.